So usually we have a little bit more balance where the crop sector does fairly well and brings in quite a bit of the dollars to the ag sector. In 2025, we had basically as big a disparity as there's ever been. A lot of dollars going into that livestock sector, not as many dollars going into the crop sector. And that's despite the fact we had record yields for a lot of the commodities that we grow on the crop side.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Vandal Theory, a podcast about science and research at University of Idaho. My name is Lee Cooper, and I'll be your host for the day. I'm a science writer and editor here at University of Idaho, and today I am joined by Danae. Hi.
Hi, Lee. I'm Danae Lenz, the External Communications Coordinator at U of I.
So today we are discussing the economics of agriculture in Idaho. And probably the simplest question to get us started, Danae, how's your grocery bill looking?
Rough.
No kidding. I'd agree.
Yeah, it's rough. I specifically noticed, I assume we'll talk about this a little today. Maybe I'll learn something. But I wanted to make an Irish stew, and I needed to go get a roast. And it was just like a 2-pound roast, and this thing was $30.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. So, that's probably the most egregious thing I've noticed recently, but generally just have noticed quite a bit of an uptick in general costs.
Yeah, I would definitely say meat has gone up, and we will tackle that today. To do that, we are meeting Brett Wilder, an assistant professor and area extension educator in the Department of Agricultural Economics and Rural Sociology. Agriculture shapes Idaho's economy in profound ways, but behind the headlines about record revenues is a much more complicated financial picture. Wilder explains the forces driving today's agricultural economy and why the industry is experiencing what he calls a tale of two economies. Ready to go, Danae?
I think so. Am I going to get hungry listening to this?
Absolutely. Let's go. Hey, Brett. Nice to see you on the podcast. Welcome.
Hey Lee, thanks for having me.
Can you introduce yourself to everyone real quick?
Absolutely. My name is Brett Wilder. I'm an area extension educator in farm business management with the University of Idaho. My role is to look at financial conditions of Idaho agriculture. How is agriculture important to our state's economy? My job is to look at what is cost of production for farmers and ranchers in the state of Idaho and try to find strategies and ways that those folks could be successful and provide education on what those folks can do to add those practices to their operations.
So today we're going to talk all about the economics of Idaho's agricultural communities, basically. Before we dive into some of the nittier grittier stuff, can you just help us place this? How important is agriculture to Idaho's economy?
You really can't talk about Idaho's economy and not talk about agriculture. I have a colleague, Phil Watson, who puts out a report called the Economic Contributions of Agribusiness in Idaho. And so most recent one was 2022. And as you look at the overarching contribution of production agriculture, food manufacturing, and all the different ways agriculture touches Idaho's economy, it makes up around 17% of all economic output for the state, which is significant. Provides somewhere around 1 in 9 jobs. And so over 10% of folks have some kind of a direct impact in agriculture. And then as you dig into even just on the farm level, the production level, that's around 3%, a little over 3% of GDP. When you rank us against all the other states in the United States, we are 5th in terms of how large our percentage of GDP is that comes from production agriculture versus the rest of what we do. Only behind a couple states in the Midwest. And so relative to the whole pie, it's extremely important. What becomes a big question at the end of the year is, especially going into the spring where we have legislators making decisions, where we have producers making planting decisions, is how did agriculture form up at the end of the year? How did it perform? And we get a number from USDA that comes out about 18 months after the end of each year.
Oh, wow. Hold on. 18 months. Okay, so for 2025, that report won't come out until 2027?
Yes.
Wow.
So we put out a forecast of what the end of 2025 was in January of
Okay.
2026. And so as we look back on 2025, we're actually looking at all-time high cash receipts for the state of Idaho.
Is that basically like money made?
So cash receipts would be top line revenue item. So not necessarily, but
Okay.
total dollars earned. And so we were looking at an all-time high record at $12.1 billion. And that's just production ag. So that is
Okay.
cattle and calves, that's milk, that's chicken eggs, beets, potatoes, but not necessarily the further processing part of that. And so 12.1 billion sounds like a big number. When you
Yeah.
dig into the weeds, it's a little interesting because if you read headlines, you hear that agriculture's in a really tight spot. But here we are with all-time high cash receipts, dollars coming in. And that's a little bit of a tale of two economies. We have a cattle and livestock sector that's done fairly well. First time since 2003 that cash receipts from cattle and calves would have outperformed milk. So 3.9
Oh.
billion from cattle and calves, 3.85 billion from milk. Milk's usually the biggest economic driver. And some of those cattle and calves came from the dairy industry. So certainly the dairy industry is still the big economic driver.
So there's a little bit of crossover there. Okay.
Yeah, little bit of crossover there. They are, at the end of the day, still cattle, and some of those cattle do go into the meat system. And then that other livestock portion is trout, sheep, goats, chicken eggs. Livestock altogether made up 68% of all cash receipts for Idaho in 2025. It has never been that big of a share of the pie in the entirety of this data series, which goes all the way back to 1924.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yep. So usually we have a little bit more balance where the crop sector does fairly well and brings in quite a bit of the dollars to the ag sector. In 2025, we had basically as big a disparity as there's ever been. A lot of dollars going into that livestock sector, not as many dollars going into the crop sector. And that's despite the fact we had record yields for a lot of the commodities that we grow on the crop side.
So when you say this is a tale of two economies, we're really talking these have separated themselves and there's different stories for each one of these parts.
There's one story that really is the same across the board, and that is
Okay.
higher cost of production. And so, cost of production, if you look at the world we live in today, I don't think it's a surprise to anybody, regardless of your background, that we had serious inflation post COVID.
Sure. Yeah, yeah.
And so, for agriculture, that meant from 2021 to 2022, roughly a 40% just flat increase in all production costs at a minimum. If you look at machinery and equipment costs, up around 70% in that window. Certain things that are just quite a bit higher than they were. You talk about even interest rates that are coming down. Interest expenses are still 78% higher for Idaho farmers and ranchers than they were in 2021. You take all those line items on everybody's balance sheet, the livestock folks have been able to absorb it a little bit better because their top line revenues have increased dramatically. Some of that is due to extremely low supplies. Some of that's due to food trends that are prioritizing proteins in the diet. A little bit of column A, a little column B. But across the board, labor expenses are higher, up 6% just this last year. Storage and transportation costs higher, up around 9%. The things that are down are in 2025, fuel costs were down a little bit. Fertilizer expenditures were expected to be down, even though prices were higher, as folks could not afford to use as much as they typically do. Feed expenses were down, so for benefits the livestock guys at the direct expense of the crop folks. So all of those things, as you look at the whole picture, there were some government dollars that came in. There was talk of that $12 billion that came through in terms of bridge payments, 11 billion to row crops, 1 billion to specialty, mostly to sugar on that front. We still don't know all the details of that last billion. The first 11 billion, Idaho should receive somewhere between 60 and 80 million of those dollars, which is less than 0.5% of our state's production expenses.
Is that expected to come through this over this next year?
Supposed to be by the end of February. As far as I know,
Oh.
those payments have not gone out yet. So maybe sometime before June.
So let's dig into the beef side of the economy. What are driving those really high profit margins there?
Yeah, let's get into cattle. Cattle operates on a fairly predictable 10 to 12-year cycle. It's called the cattle cycle.
Inventive.
Very inventive, I know. The first part of that cycle is expansion. And so those are periods where the overall cattle inventory in the US is growing. And then the longer and larger part of that cycle is what we call contraction, where that cattle inventory is declining. And that's generally happening for a couple different reasons. Sometimes it's kicked off by a drought scenario. Sometimes it's because operations are no longer profitable. And so there's consolidation. What we had in this most recent cycle is we had large periods of drought and low profitability, which led folks to exit, and there's been consolidation all over the country. Right now, as of January 1st, we found out at the end of January, we got the numbers, we are still in contraction and at the lowest cattle inventory that we've had in the United States since 1951.
Oh, that's quite extreme.
Quite extreme when you think about it over the course of time. It hasn't felt like that for the average consumer because the US beef producer has become quite a bit more efficient over that period of time. Up until about 2022, we were still breaking records for actual beef production, just getting those animals larger, being more efficient at how we use those carcasses going through the slaughter channel. But we've reached a point where we just can't keep up with that. There's also a fairly large issue going on at the southern border between the United States and Mexico. The United States usually imports somewhere around 70 to 120,000 head of cattle a month from Mexico into our slaughter channel. We have not been able to do that since the middle of last year due to a parasite called New World screwworm.
Oh,
It's an external parasite that is fairly aggressive and can cause some serious issues. Those animals that are infected are still going into slaughter channels in Mexico, especially. We don't have it in the US currently. There's been, I think, one case in a horse in Florida, and that's it so far. USDA has been very good at isolating it. So not only do we have our lowest cattle inventory since the 1950s, but we're not bringing in other animals that help keep our processing plants functioning. So if you go back to 2020, if you talk to a cattle producer, they would have told you, hey, we're in a bad place right now. The packers are making all the money, and packers had the vast majority of the margins that were being made, sometimes multiple hundreds of dollars per head. And some of these processors are
oh,
running 5,000 animals a day. Right now, we're in a situation where because inventories are tight, there's not enough animals to go through all these plants. Packers are probably losing a couple $100 per head or somewhere around break even, depending on who they are. And cow-calf operator has all the leverage in that system and is earning somewhere between $800 and $1,000 per calf right now.
okay. All right. So, first big thing is that just our herds are lower, AKA, you can charge more for, for them. Is there anything else affecting the price?
A few things. One is the food trend deal, and I'm not going to claim to be a nutritionist, but we did get a new food pyramid, and those things do have a trickle effect through the system. The government's a large buyer of food, whether
Hmm.
that's through schools or prisons or other programs. Hospitals sometimes are impacted by those programs where we start to prioritize protein on the plate. The Make America Healthy Again movement, semaglutides, the GLP-1s, which are being used reportedly by upwards of maybe 20% of the population, is expected to be on those at some point. And that has an impact on the types of foods people are choosing to eat. Less sweets, more savory things. When you go out with a group of people, it changes what you order as a group. And so seeing even at extremely high prices, seeing record demand for beef, for lamb, for chicken, for pork, for basically all proteins. And so moving through the supplies that we have at a rapid pace. Oftentimes when you get into this situation, you'll have a little bit of a demand driven top where the buyers say, okay, maybe I'm going to eat a little less beef, but I'm going to have a little bit more filler grains and other things on the plate. Maybe I'm going to eat a few more vegetables. And we're just not seeing the demand shift there keep up with what's going on in proteins.
Okay, so let's switch to the other side of the agricultural economy, grains. We have a bazillion of them.
We have a ton of them. Really, what happened is globally, we're very good at producing grains. If we go back to 2022, 2021, there was this big topic that everybody was pretty worked up about called the Russia-Ukraine war. Ukraine is a major producer of wheat and barley and other cereal crops.
Okay.
There was legitimate concern that we were going to lose that crop. And if we did, there was legitimate concern that there was going to be lack of food access all over the world. And prices of grains were pushed through the roof as that risk was present. People grew a lot of grains in response to that. That's the last time we've seen positive profit margins for crop producers, because ever since then we had that large level of production and then we haven't had homes for it. How do we use those up? Through feeding it to people and livestock generally. Population rates are not what they were. We really have been on a extremely slow growth curve for what world populations are, and actually in our lifetime probably expect to see world populations decline. So that's a whole different shift from where we were. If we go back, even when I was a kid in agriculture and some of these programs, we have conversations about we need to keep pushing yields. We need to help the world grow more food because we need to feed the world population. We need to put an end to starvation. If you look at the data, starvation's basically been put to an end or as close to it as we could get since about the 80s. And then if we've just had extreme growth in what's going on in terms of production. And so something that's an interesting case study to go back to is there's a lot of conversation about what are the long-term impacts of U.S. policy. In the 1970s, we had a food trend that's very opposite of what we're seeing today, where we were making the shift from lard to vegetable oils and soybean oils in cooking. And demand for that got so strong that Richard Nixon actually put an embargo on U.S. ability to export soybean oil, said, hey, we need it here domestically. You cannot sell it. And the world said, hey, we need that. Let's go in and let's invest in places that can grow their production. And so the world, including U.S. companies, invested in Brazil and Argentina and places that had the ability to potentially keep up with growth. And so as we've gone through, we can kind of look at growth trends over that period. I've found some data that going back to 1961 to 2023, in the United States over that period, we got 182% better at cereal grain production. So cereal grains would be corns, wheat, barley, etc. And we did that on 15% less land.
Okay, wow.
Yeah, so extremely impressive. Some of these other countries, as we've invested in them over the same period, Brazil produced 941% more in 2023 than they did in 1961. And so we helped all these other countries get better and better and better. They could do it cheaper than us, and they can still do it cheaper than us. We no longer have a production problem on the grains globally. And frankly, without major crop failures somewhere, we never will again because we're just too good at it globally. And human and livestock populations are not going to keep up with the rate of improvement in production.
Okay.
And so where we are, we're going to continue to have this split economy until we have some research and development on what do we do with the rest of this crop production that we have. Is it biofuels? There's a big push for year-round E15 from Chart of the Farm groups. Do we feed it to more animals to add value to it? Oftentimes, 1 pound of gain on an animal takes 3 to 6 pounds of feed. And so we add value to grain crops by feeding them to an animal. There's lots of different paths forward. And this is why I'm really glad to work at the University of Idaho, places like that have research, because we're at a stage where there is a big shift in how farmers think about profitability, how farmers think about production. It's no longer, I just want to produce as much as I possibly can. We're starting to see a lot of focus on how do I produce profitably? Maybe I don't need to have the biggest yield per acre, but I want to have the largest margin per acre. Can I do it with less fertilizer? Can I do it with less chemical and still get yields? What varieties are going to do that? And so that's kind of we're at the cusp where the next 10 or 15 years of agricultural improvement are going to be spent on how do I make small changes to improve margins, not how can I make changes to improve yields.
Okay. So I feel like I would be remiss in not asking how the potato is doing, being an Idaho podcast.
Yeah. Talk about very important crop to the state of Idaho. It's one of two that had double-digit declines in cash receipts in 2025. Potatoes and sugar beets down 12 and 17% respectively.
That hurts.
Part of that is coming off of a pretty good high point from a couple years ago in 23. And the other part of it is they, just like everyone else, have more production than they have homes for right now. And so talking to farmers out in the world, I've heard conversations about some of the large potato buyers are cutting back acres that they would like to contract for the year moving forward. It's not looking like 2026 is going to see any higher prices. So potatoes, generally one of the safer, bigger cash crops for producers, and one right now that they are maybe less excited to put in the ground because it's very expensive to grow. And in 2025, we had this overproduction of potatoes, great yields. It's fantastic. And we had some people that grew uncontracted acres. If you were not contracted or you produced over your contract in 2025, you might have paid somebody to take those extra potatoes.
Oh, man.
There are people in Eastern Idaho right now who probably just have piles out in the field.
That seems so terrible. I mean, just from a food waste perspective.
And it's a hard thing because you go into at the start of the year and the companies that give out production contracts, they try to forecast how much they're going to go through.
Sure.
Farmers that put it in the ground have an idea of what their yield should be. And when there's overproduction, a lot of these guys they'll make an effort to send excess to food banks and food pantries and things like that. And it's unfortunate there's a cost associated with that, right?
Sure. Yeah, it seems like it's something that nobody wants, like that to be the issue. It doesn't help them. It doesn't help. Like, I mean, there's lots of people it's just not helping.
And it's not just potatoes. Onions had a really bad year for Idaho, another very Idaho crop. Sugar beets had a very bad year. And those are ones that you can't just give to a person to eat. Those do still make it into the livestock system. All three of those things do make it into the feedlot system, helps us work through some of those excess products. But because they have access to those feeds for nothing, they're not buying other things, which also further pushes those prices lower.
So before we wrap up, one last question. I know the tariff rules in the US are changing relatively often. In general, how would higher tariffs affect Idaho agricultural economics?
That's a bit of a loaded question in the fact that it's a different answer depending on what commodity you're talking about. There's two groups of people, advocates of tariffs. And the advocates of tariffs are people that have small commodities where the U.S. imports most of what we consume as a population. So examples there would be onions, lamb, places where over 50% of what we consume in the U.S. was imported, generally produced in another country with worse production practices or lower quality crop, but much cheaper. And so drives domestic prices down to a point where it's hard to be profitable. People in that environment are big advocates of tariffs because it protects their industries and helps them be profitable. Then we have the other side of people that really have not enjoyed the tariffs, and these are the large exporting crops. So your corns and your soybeans specifically are big ones here, where we produce way more than we could ever use domestically. We don't import a lot, or what we do import is a very specific use case, and we rely on our ability to trade with the world to move through those commodities. And those folks have really not enjoyed tariffs because it's made us less competitive on a world stage. And also, as a trade bundle with different countries, has certainly had an impact on our ability to have long-term trade agreements where we are trying to get our products out to other places. At the end of the day, tariffs are just a tool. You and I talked about these are changing all the time. We're making this podcast on February 20th. And just this morning was a Supreme Court ruling that tariffs in the way that they were done were not considered to be legal. And while we're making this podcast, I believe there is a press hearing going on right now about what the path forward might be. So the answer is there's still going to be some trade policies taking place. There's going to be some volatility from that in agriculture. What I'd like to remind folks as we come down to this is we are in a situation where global overproduction exists. Our world trade environment is not what it was 10 years ago or 20 years ago. And we have to decide as a population, do we want to have higher consumer costs and protect domestic production, or do we want to have free trade? And that is a real conversation that's going to have to take place. And I'm glad that I'm not somebody that has to write that policy.
Well, Brett, thank you so much for coming on today.
Thanks, Lee. Glad to be here.
So, Danae, what'd you think?
I really appreciated the explanation for why my beef roast cost me $30.
I know.
Even when something is frustrating like that, it feels better to know why. So I appreciate that. So I don't think it's come up on this podcast before, but my family owned a farm when I was growing up.
Oh, okay.
And I was not involved in the day-to-day, but I know just how much time and effort and literally blood, sweat, and tears went into making a crop grow from beginning to end. And him talking about potatoes just rotting in a field was absolutely devastating to me. And I can't stop thinking about it. It's just a very vivid image in my mind that makes me feel a lot of things.
Oh my gosh, it was just crushing, wasn't it, to hear that? Like, obviously that's never the goal of any farmer. They care so much about what they do, and they don't want that to happen either. It's just, yeah, it was crushing.
Yeah, made me pretty sad.
So for me, it shouldn't be surprising, but it's one of those topics that I just haven't thought that much about, the economics of agriculture, and how interconnected everything is, and yet still, even within that system, there's pushes and pulls against each other. How something that's happening in Ukraine is causing a change in how farms in America are growing their crops. How many cows are on the ranches are changing who has control over how much money packagers are making. And how separate, even despite the fact that it's the food that feeds the cows, how the agricultural side is different from the ranching side. It just all those little nuances and connective pieces that pull and tug at each other. Just something I haven't thought a lot about, and I found very interesting.
Yeah, I did as well.
All right, everyone. Thank you for listening to the Vandal Theory. You can visit our website, uidaho.edu/Vandal Theory, to learn all about our research, or email us at vandaltheory@uidaho.edu to ask any questions you might have. We're on all the podcasting platforms, so make sure you go rate, review, and subscribe. My name is Lee Cooper.
And I'm Danae Lums.
Thanks for listening.